The ground beneath Florissant, Colorado started trembling at 2:30 in the afternoon on a scorching August day in 1882. And Samuel Zane was halfway through shoeing a mare when the entire livery stable began to shake like God himself was rattling the earth in his fists. He dropped his tools and stumbled backward as the wooden beams groaned overhead, splinters raining down around him as the mare whinnied in terror and kicked against her restraints. The quake lasted no more than 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds changed everything Samuel thought he knew about fear, purpose, and the woman he had never properly spoken to despite watching her walk past his shop every Tuesday and Thursday for the better part of 6 months. When the shaking stopped, Samuel stood frozen for a moment in the settling dust, his heart hammering against his ribs. The mare had broken free and bolted out the stable doors that hung crooked on their hinges. He barely noticed. Through the jagged opening where part of the stable wall had collapsed, he could see the main street of Florissant in chaos. People were stumbling out of buildings, shouting for loved ones, pointing at structures that had partially collapsed. The general store had lost its entire front facade. The boarding house where the schoolteacher lived had crumbled on its western side. The schoolteacher, Grace Donovan. Samuel's blood turned to ice. It was Thursday afternoon, and Grace always spent her Thursday afternoons in the millinery shop, the small building tucked between the land office and the boarding house. He could see it now, or what was left of it. The entire structure had collapsed into itself. Nothing but a heap of timber, brick, and plaster where a cheerful yellow building had stood just moments before. His legs moved before his mind caught up. He ran across the street, dodging debris and frightened horses, his boots kicking up clouds of dust. Other townspeople were already gathering, their faces pale with shock, some bleeding from cuts, others simply standing and staring at the destruction. Samuel pushed through the small crowd forming near the millinery ruins. Was anyone inside? Someone shouted. "Grace Donovan," Samuel said, his voice hoarse. "The schoolteacher. She comes here every Thursday." Old Mrs. Fletcher, who owned the dress shop across the street, let out a sob. "And Harriet Mills, she owns the shop. Oh Lord, they were both in there." Samuel was already moving toward the rubble, pulling off his leather work gloves and tossing them aside. He needed to feel with his bare hands, needed every advantage. The pile of debris looked impossibly massive, boards and bricks and chunks of plaster stacked in a chaotic mountain at least 8 feet high. He grabbed the first beam he could reach and hauled it backward, muscles straining. "Help me," he barked at the men standing nearby. "Do not just stand there. They could be alive under there." That spurred them into action. Tom Brennan, the blacksmith who was built like an ox, moved to Samuel's left and began lifting boards. Peter Yamada, who worked at the sawmill, started on the right side. More men joined in, and soon there were a dozen hands pulling away debris, working frantically but carefully, knowing that one wrong move could cause the remaining structure to shift and collapse further. "Grace," Samuel shouted into the rubble. "Grace, can you hear me?" "Make a sound if you can hear me." Silence. Just the creak of settling wood and the labored breathing of the men working. Samuel's hands were already bleeding, splinters driven deep into his palms, but he did not slow down. He could not. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Grace's face. Those intelligent green eyes, the way her dark hair always had a few curls escaping from the pins she used to secure it. The genuine smile she gave to everyone she passed on the street. She had a laugh that sounded like music, though he had only heard it from a distance. He had never worked up the courage to speak more than a polite greeting to her. He should have talked to her. He should have walked right up to her and introduced himself properly. Asked if he could accompany her to the church social or bring her flowers or something. anything. Now she might be dead under this rubble, and she would never know that he thought about her every day, that he had been planning for weeks to finally approach her but kept losing his nerve. "We need to be systematic about this," Tom Brennan said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Start from the top and work down. Pile the debris to the side so it does not roll back." Samuel nodded, though it killed him to slow down even slightly. Tom was right. They had to be smart about this. He forced himself to breathe, to think. The building had collapsed inward, which meant if Grace and Harriet had been in the center of the shop, they might have a pocket of space around them, might have air, might still be alive. An hour passed. Then, too, the sun beat down mercilessly, and Samuel's shirt was soaked through with sweat. His hands were a mess of blood and splinters, his forearms scraped raw from rough edges of broken wood. Other townspeople brought water and bandages, but Samuel barely paused to drink. He just kept digging, lifting, hauling. Some of the men had to step away to rest, but Samuel did not stop. Could not stop. "Son, you need to take a break," Tom said gently, gripping Samuel's shoulder. "You are going to collapse." "She is under there," Samuel said through gritted teeth. "I am not stopping until we find her." He had never said anything to anyone about his feelings for Grace. It was not the kind of thing a man like him talked about. He was just a farrier, the son of a drifter who had died drunk in a ditch when Samuel was 15. He had built his business from nothing, worked himself half to death to earn respect in this town. Grace was educated, refined, from a good family back in Boston. Her father had been a banker before he died, and she had come west to teach school after her mother passed, looking for a new start. She was so far above him it was almost laughable that he had even entertained thoughts of courting her. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was getting her out alive. 3 hours in, they finally broke through to what had been the interior of the shop. Samuel's heart leaped when he saw a clear space, a pocket formed by a collapsed support beam that had fallen at an angle, creating a small protected area beneath it. He dropped to his knees and peered into the darkness. "Grace, Harriet, are you in there?" A faint sound. A cough. Then a weak voice. "Help, please help." Samuel's entire body flooded with relief so intense he felt dizzy. "We are here, we are getting you out. Can you tell me who you are? Are you hurt?" "Grace," the voice said, stronger now. "Grace Donovan, my leg is trapped." "Harriet is here too, but she is not moving. I think she hit her head. Please hurry." "We are coming right now," Samuel said. "Stay calm. We are going to get you out." He attacked the rubble with renewed energy, adrenaline overriding his exhaustion. Tom and Peter and the others worked alongside him, and slowly, carefully, they widened the opening. Samuel could see into the space now. There was Grace, her dress torn and covered in dust and blood, her face pale but her eyes open and alert. She was pinned from the waist down by a heavy beam. Next to her lay Harriet Mills, an older woman in her 50s, unconscious but breathing. "Stay very still," Samuel instructed. "We need to lift this beam off you, and I do not want anything else to shift." Grace nodded, her eyes meeting his. Even covered in dust and clearly in pain, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He positioned himself at one end of the beam while Tom took the other. Peter and another man stood ready to pull Grace free the moment the beam lifted. "On 3, Tom said. 1, 2, 3. They heaved upward, muscles screaming in protest. The beam rose slowly, inch by agonizing inch. The moment there was enough clearance, Peter and the other man grabbed Grace under her arms and pulled her out. She cried out in pain, but she was free. They carried her away from the rubble and laid her gently on a blanket someone had spread on the ground. Samuel and Tom eased the beam back down and immediately went for Harriet. It took another 20 minutes of careful work, but they got her out too, still unconscious but alive. Doc Henderson, who had been dealing with injuries at his office, finally arrived and began examining both women. Samuel stood back, chest heaving, hands shaking from exhaustion and relief. Grace was alive. She was hurt, but she was alive. That was all that mattered. Doc Henderson worked quickly, checking pulses and examining injuries. After several minutes, he looked up at the anxious faces surrounding him. "Harriet has a serious head injury. I need to get her to my office immediately. Grace has a broken leg and some lacerations, but she should recover fully." She was very lucky. The men carried Harriet away on a makeshift stretcher. Grace tried to sit up, but Doc Henderson gently pushed her back down. "You are not going anywhere just yet, young lady. That leg needs to be splinted before we move you." "I want to thank whoever pulled me out," Grace said, her voice raspy from dust and dehydration. "Where is he?" Several people pointed at Samuel, who stood a few feet away, covered head to toe in dirt and blood, looking like he had crawled through hell itself. Grace's eyes widened when she saw him. "You," she said softly, "the farrier, I have seen you before." Samuel's throat felt tight. He managed to nod. "Yes, madam, Samuel Zane. You saved my life, Mr. Zane. Anyone would have done the same. But you are the one who did it." Her green eyes, somehow still bright despite everything she had been through, locked onto his. "Thank you." Before he could respond, Doc Henderson shooed him away. "Go get yourself cleaned up, Samuel. Those hands need attention before infection sets in. I will take care of Miss Donovan." Samuel wanted to stay, wanted to make sure Grace was truly all right, but he forced himself to step back. She was in good hands now. He had done what he could. As he walked away, his legs finally started to shake from exhaustion, and the pain in his hands suddenly roared to life, making him wince with every movement. He looked down at them and saw they were worse than he had thought, torn and bleeding and filled with debris. Mrs. Fletcher caught his arm as he passed her. "That was the bravest thing I have ever seen, young man. You did not stop for a second. You saved them both." Samuel just nodded, too tired to form words. He made his way back to what remained of his livery stable, which had survived mostly intact aside from some structural damage. He pumped water from the well outside and plunged his hands into the cold stream, hissing at the sting. Using his teeth and his limited dexterity, he managed to pull out the worst of the splinters, then wrapped his hands in relatively clean rags. He sat down on an overturned crate and finally let himself feel everything. The terror when he realized Grace was trapped, the desperation of those hours digging, the overwhelming relief when he heard her voice, and now this strange, light feeling in his chest knowing she was safe. Knowing she knew his name. The next few days were chaos in Florissant. The earthquake had damaged dozens of buildings, and everyone was working to repair homes and businesses. 3 people had died. A child who had been playing near the church when the bell tower collapsed, an elderly man whose heart apparently gave out from the shock, and Harriet Mills, who never woke from her head injury. The town mourned together, holding a service for the dead and working to rebuild. Samuel threw himself into the work, helping repair buildings during the day and working on his own stable at night. His hands healed slowly, still stiff and sore, but he pushed through. He did not see Grace during those first days. He heard she was staying at the boarding house, recovering, her broken leg set in a splint. He wanted to visit her, but he could not think of a good reason to show up at her door. What would he say? A week after the quake, Grace sent for him. He was replacing boards on the stable roof when young Timothy O'Brien ran up, red-faced and out of breath. "Mr. Zane, Miss Donovan asked me to fetch you. She wants to see you at the boarding house." Samuel nearly dropped his hammer. "She wants to see me." "Yes, sir. Right away," she said. Samuel climbed down from the roof, his heart suddenly pounding. He brushed the worst of the sawdust from his clothes, ran his fingers through his hair to smooth it, and then gave up. There was no making himself presentable. He was a working man, and he looked like one. If Grace wanted to see him, she would have to take him as he was. He walked to the boarding house, his stomach tied in knots. Mrs. Patterson, who owned the place, opened the door when he knocked and smiled warmly. "Come in, Mr. Zane. Miss Donovan is in the sitting room. She has been asking for you." The boarding house sitting room was small but comfortable, with flowered wallpaper and lace curtains. Grace sat in an armchair near the window, her injured leg propped up on an ottoman, a quilt spread across her lap. She was dressed in a simple blue dress, her dark hair neatly pinned, and despite the paleness of her skin and the shadows under her eyes, she looked lovely. She smiled when she saw him. "Mr. Zane, thank you for coming." "Of course, Miss Donovan, how are you feeling?" "Much better, thanks to you." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Please sit down. I have wanted to speak with you properly since the earthquake, but Doc Henderson would not let me leave this room." Samuel sat, feeling awkward and too large for the delicate furniture. His rough hands looked out of place in this refined setting. "I am glad to see you recovering well." "Mr. Zane, I owe you my life," Grace said, her voice serious. "I have been told that you dug for nearly 4 hours without stopping, even after others needed to rest. That you tore your hands to pieces pulling away debris, that you refused to give up." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Why did you do that for me?" Samuel's throat went dry. This was the moment. He could deflect, could say something humble and generic, or he could tell her the truth. Looking into those green eyes, he found he could not lie. "Because the thought of you dying under that rubble was more than I could bear," he said quietly. "Because I have watched you walk past my shop for months and thought you were the most remarkable woman I had ever seen. Because I was a coward who never worked up the courage to speak to you, and I could not let you die without you knowing that someone cared about you that much." Grace stared at him, her lips parted in surprise. A flush rose in her cheeks. "You never spoke to me because you were nervous. You are educated, refined, from a good family. I am a farrier with dirt under his fingernails and no family to speak of. I did not think I had any right to approach you." "Samuel," Grace said softly, and the sound of his first name on her lips sent a shiver through him. "May I tell you something? I noticed you too. Every Tuesday and Thursday when I walked past your shop, I hoped you would say something more than just a polite hello. I would walk slowly, give you every opportunity, but you never did. I thought perhaps you found me boring or too serious." Samuel's heart felt like it might burst from his chest. "You noticed me. How could I not? You are kind to the animals you work with. I have seen you gentle with the most skittish horses. You always tip your hat to ladies, even the ones that some men in town ignore. And you have the most honest face I have ever seen." She smiled, and it was like sunlight breaking through clouds. "When I was trapped in that darkness, barely able to breathe, do you know what I thought about? I thought about all the things I had not done, the chances I had not taken. I thought about you, and how I wished I had been brave enough to start a conversation myself." "I cannot believe we were both such fools," Samuel said, feeling a smile tug at his lips for the first time since the earthquake. Grace laughed, that musical sound he had heard from a distance but never up close. "Apparently so. Well, we have a chance to remedy that now. Samuel Zane, would you like to stay for tea? I think we have quite a bit to talk about." "I would like that very much, Miss Donovan." "Grace," she corrected. "Please call me Grace. Only if you call me Samuel." They talked for 2 hours that afternoon. Mrs. Patterson brought tea and cookies, and Samuel told Grace about his life. Growing up with a father who drank himself to death. Working odd jobs as a boy. apprenticing with a farrier in Denver, and finally saving enough to buy the livery stable in Florissant 3 years ago. Grace told him about Boston, about losing both her parents within a year of each other, about how she had needed to escape the memories and the pity and start fresh somewhere new. She loved teaching, loved seeing children learn to read and write, but she was lonely in Florissant. She had friends but no real connections, no one she felt truly understood her. "I understand lonely," Samuel said. "I have built a good business here, earned respect, but at the end of the day I go home to an empty room above the stable. I always thought that was enough, that I did not need more. But then I saw you, and I realized what I was missing." Grace reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, careful of the healing cuts and scrapes. "We do not have to be lonely anymore." From that day forward, Samuel visited Grace every evening after work. She was confined to the boarding house for several weeks while her leg healed, so he would clean up as best he could and spend his evenings sitting with her, talking about everything and nothing. They discussed books, though Samuel was embarrassed to admit he had not read many. Grace offered to lend him some of hers, and soon he was reading by lamplight in his room above the stable, discovering worlds he had never imagined. They talked about their dreams for the future. Samuel wanted to expand his business, maybe buy some land and raise horses. Grace wanted to continue teaching but also hoped to have a family someday. "I want children of my own," she said one evening, her cheeks pink. "I know it is forward to discuss such things, but I feel like we should be honest with each other about what we want." "I want that too," Samuel said. "I want a family, a real home, someone to build a life with." "Someone like me?" Grace asked, her eyes meeting his. "Exactly like you." The town of Florissant had largely recovered from the earthquake by the time Grace was able to walk again with the aid of a cane. The damaged buildings had been repaired or demolished and rebuilt. Life returned to its normal rhythms, though there was a new appreciation among the townspeople for each other, a recognition that everything could change in an instant. On a cool October evening, 2 months after the earthquake, Samuel took Grace for a walk. She still limped slightly, but Doc Henderson said she would make a full recovery in time. They walked slowly down the main street, past the rebuilt millinery shop that now stood where Harriet Mills's business had been. A new owner from Denver had taken it over. Past the general store, the church, the boarding house. "There is something I need to tell you," Samuel said as they reached the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open land. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the Rocky Mountains rising in the distance like ancient guardians. Grace looked up at him, the fading light catching in her eyes. "What is it?" "I am in love with you," Samuel said simply. "I think I have been since the first time I saw you, but I know it for certain now. These past 2 months have been the happiest of my life. When I wake up, my first thought is of you. When I go to sleep, I am already looking forward to seeing you the next day. You make everything better, everything brighter." Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks, but she was smiling. "I love you too. I think I fell in love with you when you pulled me from that rubble, and I saw how destroyed your hands were, how hard you had worked to save me. But it has only grown stronger every day since. You are the best man I have ever known, Samuel Zane." He cupped her face in his hands, those scarred, calloused hands that had dug through rubble for her, and kissed her gently. She kissed him back, her arms winding around his neck, and for a long moment the rest of the world disappeared. There was just the two of them, this woman and this man who had found each other in the aftermath of disaster. When they finally pulled apart, Samuel reached into his pocket. "I know this is fast. I know we have only really known each other for 2 months. But I also know that life is short and uncertain, and I do not want to waste another moment. "Grace Donovan, will you marry me?" He held out a simple gold ring. It was not fancy, but it was all he could afford, and he had spent weeks' worth of earnings on it. Grace looked at the ring, then at his face, and fresh tears streamed down her cheeks. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. They stood there in the fading light, holding each other, two people who had almost lost everything and found each other instead. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church. The whole town turned out for the wedding, still remembering the earthquake and the dramatic rescue. Grace wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Fletcher had helped her make, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Samuel wore a new suit, the first he had ever owned, and he felt uncomfortable and stiff in it until he saw Grace walking down the aisle toward him. Then he forgot about everything except her. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony, his words about love and commitment taking on extra weight after everything the town had been through. When Samuel kissed his bride, the whole church erupted in applause and cheers. They moved into a small house Samuel had rented on the outskirts of town, a simple 2-room dwelling that Grace immediately began transforming into a home. She hung curtains and arranged furniture and filled the space with small touches that made it feel warm and welcoming. Samuel had never lived anywhere that felt like a real home before. He would come in from work and Grace would be there, maybe preparing dinner or grading papers from her students, and his heart would swell with gratitude for this life he had stumbled into. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. Money was tight, especially after Samuel invested in new equipment for the stable. Grace continued teaching, but the school board paid women teachers far less than they paid men, which frustrated them both. They disagreed about small things, like how much firewood to buy for winter, and whether they should splurge on a new quilt or save every penny. But they learned to navigate these challenges together, talking through problems instead of letting resentment build. The physical intimacy of marriage was a revelation to them both. Samuel had known desire before, but he had never known the profound connection that came from being with someone you truly loved. Grace was shy at first but gradually became more confident, and their nights together were filled with tenderness and passion. They fit together in every way that mattered. In the spring of 1884, Grace told Samuel she was pregnant. He was shoeing a horse when she came to the stable, her face glowing with joy and nerves. She did not say anything at first, just stood there watching him work. When he finally noticed her and set down his tools, she said simply, "We are going to have a baby." Samuel crossed the space between them in 3 strides and picked her up, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "We are going to be parents," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I am going to be a father." "You are going to be a wonderful father," Grace said, cupping his face. "This baby is so lucky to have you." The pregnancy was difficult at times. Grace suffered from terrible sickness in the early months, and Samuel would hold her hair back and rub her back and feel helpless. But as the months progressed and her belly swelled, they both grew more excited. They picked out names, argued playfully about whether it would be a boy or girl, and made plans for the future. Samuel built a cradle from scratch, working on it late into the night, determined to make it perfect. On a snowy December morning, Grace went into labor. Samuel fetched Doc Henderson and then paced the main room of their house while the doctor and Mrs. Patterson attended to Grace in the bedroom. He could hear her cries of pain, and each one felt like a knife in his heart. He wanted to burst through the door and demand to be with her, but Mrs. Patterson had firmly told him to stay put. After 8 hours that felt like 8 years, he heard a different cry, the thin, wailing cry of a newborn. Samuel's legs went weak. A moment later, Mrs. Patterson opened the bedroom door, smiling. You have a son, Samuel, a healthy baby boy. And Grace is doing just fine. Samuel rushed into the room. Grace lay in the bed, exhausted and pale but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up at him with such love and pride that he felt his eyes burn with tears. "Meet your son," she said softly. Samuel sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blankets. The baby had wispy dark hair and wrinkled red skin and was the most perfect thing he had ever seen. "He is beautiful. You are beautiful. You both are just perfect. What should we name him?" Grace asked. They had discussed many names, but now, looking at his son, Samuel knew exactly what felt right. Thomas Zane. After Tom Brennan, who helped dig you out. He was a good man, and it is a good, strong name. Thomas, Grace repeated, testing it out. "I love it. Thomas Zane." Their son was healthy and loud and demanding, and Samuel had never been happier. He would come home from work and take Thomas from Grace's arms, giving her a break, walking the floor with the baby and talking to him about everything and nothing. He told Thomas about his mother, how brave and smart she was, how she had survived an earthquake and never complained about her recovery. He told him about the day they met, about the rubble and the fear and the overwhelming relief when he heard her voice. "You almost did not exist," Samuel would whisper to his son in the quiet hours of the night. "Your mother almost died before we even really met, but she survived, and here you are. You are a miracle, little one." As Thomas grew from an infant to a toddler, Florissant continued to thrive. The railroad had reached nearby Divide, bringing more commerce and settlers to the area. Samuel's business expanded, and he was able to hire an apprentice, a young man named Charlie who showed real talent with horses. Grace went back to teaching part-time, and Mrs. Patterson watched Thomas when both parents were working. When Thomas was 3 years old, Grace became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in the summer of 1887 they welcomed a daughter. They named her Anna, after Grace's mother. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair, and Samuel was immediately wrapped around her tiny finger. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Samuel's business continued to grow, and they were able to buy a larger house with a real yard where the children could play. Grace taught school for several more years before deciding to focus on raising their children full-time, though she never stopped being an educator. She taught Thomas and Anna to read before they were 5, filled their home with books, and encouraged their curiosity about the world. On quiet evenings after the children were in bed, Samuel and Grace would sit together on their front porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. They would hold hands and talk about their day, about the children, about their dreams for the future. Sometimes they would simply sit in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only comes from years of knowing someone completely. "Do you ever think about that day?" Grace asked one evening when Thomas was 10 and Anna was 7. "The earthquake." "Every day," Samuel admitted. "I think about how close I came to never really knowing you, how different my life would be if I had not been able to reach you in time." "I think about it too," Grace said. "About being trapped in the dark, hearing the men digging, and then hearing your voice. I knew in that moment that everything would be all right. Even though I did not really know you yet, I trusted you completely." She squeezed his hand. "You have never given me a reason to regret that trust." "I love you," Samuel said, the words as true and necessary as breathing. "I will always love you, and I will always love you." The years continued to pass. Thomas grew into a strong, capable young man who showed interest in following his father into the farrier trade. Anna was clever and bookish like her mother, and Grace tutored her in subjects far beyond what the local school offered. In 1895, when Thomas was 21, He married a sweet girl named Rebecca, the daughter of the man who owned the dry goods store. Samuel and Grace became grandparents a year later, when Rebecca gave birth to twin girls. Samuel was in his early 40s now, still strong and healthy, but starting to feel the years of hard physical labor in his joints. Grace's hair had threads of silver running through it, and there were lines around her eyes and mouth. But to Samuel, she was as beautiful as the day he had pulled her from the rubble. More beautiful, perhaps, because now he knew every facet of her, every strength and weakness, every quirk and habit. He knew that she hummed when she was cooking, that she read in bed every night before sleep, that she cried at weddings and laughed at jokes that were not particularly funny. He knew her completely, and he loved every part of her. Anna went to Denver for teacher training when she was 19, following in her mother's footsteps. She wrote letters home every week, and Grace treasured them, reading passages aloud to Samuel at dinner. Anna met a young lawyer in Denver, a serious, thoughtful man named David, and they married in 1898. She opened a school for girls in Denver, focusing on providing education to young women who might not otherwise have the opportunity. Samuel and Grace traveled to Denver several times a year to visit their daughter and her family. Anna and David had 3 children in quick succession, giving Samuel and Grace even more grandchildren to spoil. Thomas and Rebecca added 2 more children to their family as well, so by the time Samuel and Grace reached their 50s, they had 7 grandchildren between their 2 children. "Can you believe this is our life?" Grace asked one evening in 1902, 20 years after the earthquake. They were sitting on their porch as always, watching their grandchildren play in the yard while Thomas and Rebecca prepared dinner inside. "Sometimes I still cannot believe it is real." "It is real," Samuel said, wrapping his arm around her shoulders and pulling her close. "You are real. This family is real. We built all of this together." "You built it by refusing to give up on me," Grace said. "If you had stopped digging, if you had rested when the others did, I would have died under that rubble. Everything we have, everything we are, exists because you would not quit." "I could not quit," Samuel said simply. "Not when it was you." Grace turned to look at him, her green eyes still as bright and intelligent as they had been when she was young. "Promise me something, anything. When our time comes, we go together." "I do not want to live in a world without you in it." Samuel's throat tightened. "That is not always something we can control." "Then promise me that wherever we end up, you will find me, like you found me in the rubble. Promise me you will dig through heaven or hell or whatever comes next, and you will find me." "I promise," Samuel said, and he kissed her there on the porch while their grandchildren played and the sun set over the mountains. "I will always find you." They were blessed with many more years together. Samuel eventually retired and handed the farrier business over to Thomas, who ran it successfully and expanded it even further. Grace spent her later years writing, recording stories of her life and the history of Florissant, creating a legacy for her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They traveled a bit, visiting California and seeing the ocean for the first time, marveling at how big the world was. But they always came home to Florissant, to the town that had brought them together in the most unlikely of circumstances. They would walk down the main street, past the spot where the millinery shop had once stood, and remember the day that changed everything. The scar on Grace's leg from her broken bone never fully faded, and Samuel's hands bore the marks of the splinters and cuts from digging through debris. They wore these scars with pride, reminders of what they had survived and overcome. In the summer of 1915, Samuel fell ill with pneumonia. He was 73 years old, still strong in many ways but not as resilient as he once had been. Grace nursed him through it, sitting by his bedside day and night, refusing to leave. He recovered, but slowly, and he was never quite the same afterward. He tired more easily, moved more carefully. Grace was 71, and her own health was starting to decline. Her heart was not as strong as it once had been, and she had spells where she would feel dizzy and short of breath. But she refused to slow down, especially with Samuel needing extra care. They took care of each other, the way they had for more than 3 decades. On a warm September evening in 1918, they sat together on their porch as they had thousands of times before. Their children and grandchildren had visited that afternoon, filling the house with noise and laughter. Now it was just the two of them, watching the familiar sunset, holding hands the way they always did. "I have had a good life," Grace said softly. "Better than I ever imagined possible." "So have I," Samuel agreed. "You gave me everything I never knew I needed." "No," Grace said, squeezing his hand. "We gave it to each other." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the mountains and the stars began to appear. Samuel felt tired, more tired than he could ever remember feeling. Grace's head rested on his shoulder, and her breathing was slow and even. He closed his eyes just for a moment. Thomas found them the next morning, still sitting together on the porch, still holding hands. They had passed peacefully in the night, within minutes of each other, the way Grace had asked. The doctor said it was remarkable, almost unheard of, for two people to go so close together without violence or accident being involved. But those who knew Samuel and Grace were not surprised. They had been connected by something deeper than most people ever experienced. The town of Florissant mourned together, the way they had after the earthquake all those years ago. They buried Samuel and Grace side by side in the cemetery on the hill overlooking the town, under a large oak tree. The headstone reads simply, "Samuel Zane, 1842–1918, and Grace Donovan Zane, 1844–1918. Beloved husband and wife, parents and grandparents, together always." Thomas and Anna stood at the grave with their families, mourning their parents but also celebrating the remarkable love story they had witnessed. They told their children about the earthquake, about how Samuel had dug for hours through rubble to save the woman who would become his wife. They told them about the life their grandparents had built together, the love that had sustained them through good times and hard times. "That is what real love looks like," Anna told her daughters. "It is not just romance and grand gestures. It is showing up every day. It is refusing to give up even when things are hard. It is digging through rubble for hours because the alternative is unthinkable. Your grandmother used to say that grandfather saved her life that day," Thomas told his sons. "But grandfather always said she saved his too. He said she gave him a reason to be more than he thought he could be. She made him want to build something lasting." The family gathered at the house after the funeral, sharing memories and stories, laughing and crying together. They looked through the writings Grace had left behind, the carefully recorded history of her life and her family. On the last page, she had written a final entry. "To my children, grandchildren, and any who come after, know that love is worth fighting for. It is worth the risk of heartbreak, worth the vulnerability, worth every sacrifice. Samuel found me in the rubble when he had every reason to give up, and I spent every day after that grateful for his stubborn refusal to quit. We built a beautiful life together, filled with joy and purpose. If I have any wisdom to pass on, it is this: when you find someone worth digging through rubble for, do not let them go. Hold on tight, build something lasting, and never, ever take a single day for granted." The words became a sort of family creed, passed down through generations. Thomas ran the farrier business until his own sons took over, and it remained in the Zane family for decades. Anna's school in Denver grew and thrived, educating hundreds of young women. The Zane family tree spread and flourished, producing teachers and businesspeople and ranchers and doctors, all carrying forward the legacy of two people who found each other in the aftermath of disaster. In Florissant, the story of Samuel and Grace became legend. Parents told it to their children as an example of true love and heroism. The spot where the millinery shop had stood was marked with a plaque that read, "On August 17, 1882, an earthquake struck this town." In the rubble of this location, Samuel Zane dug for hours to rescue Grace Donovan, who would become his wife. Their love story reminds us that from destruction can come new life, and that true devotion knows no obstacle. Years turned into decades and Florissant changed and grew, but the story endured. The cemetery where Samuel and Grace were buried became a place that young couples would visit, leaving flowers at the grave as a symbol of hope that their own love might be as lasting and true. The oak tree that shaded their resting place grew large and strong, its roots intertwining beneath the earth, holding them together even in death. And though Samuel and Grace were gone from the physical world, the impact of their love radiated outward through their descendants and through everyone whose life they had touched. Their story became proof that even in the darkest moments, when the ground itself is shaking and everything seems lost, love can survive. Love can dig through rubble and refuse to give up. Love can transform disaster into destiny. In the end, what Samuel and Grace built together was not just a family or a home or a business. It was a testament to the power of devotion, the strength that comes from true partnership, and the miracle that can happen when one person refuses to give up on another. They had taken the worst day of their lives and turned it into the beginning of something extraordinary. They had found each other in the rubble, and they had built a love story for the ages. Their great-great-grandchildren would visit the cemetery 100 years after the earthquake, bringing their own children to see the grave beneath the oak tree. They would tell the story again, keeping it alive, making sure that Samuel's stubborn refusal to quit and Grace's courage in surviving were never forgotten. They would explain that this was where their family began, in a moment of terror and devastation, transformed by love into something beautiful and enduring. And on quiet evenings when the sun set behind the mountains just right, some people swore they could see two figures sitting on the porch of the old Zane house, holding hands and watching the sunset together, still connected, still in love, still together after all the years and all the changes. Just a trick of the light, most people said, but those who believed in love stories knew better. They knew that some bonds are too strong to be broken by something as small as death. They knew that when you dig through rubble for someone, when you refuse to give up on them no matter what, you create something that lasts forever. Samuel and Grace had promised to always find each other, and they had kept that promise in life and beyond. Their story was complete, their love eternal, their legacy secure. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and left the world better than they found it. And in the end, that was the greatest happy ending anyone could hope for.